It's January 30th, 1945. The Baltic Sea is so cold that the water itself is the thing trying to kill you. A woman is in that water. She went over the side of a ship a few minutes ago, into a sea that is somewhere around 1 degree above freezing, and she is still alive, which is the cruelest part because being alive in that water is not survival. It is a countdown. The cold is already in her chest. Her arms have stopped doing what she tells them to. There is a life jacket holding her face out of the sea, which means she will not drown. She will simply cool degree by degree until her heart slows and then stops, and the life jacket will keep her upright and afloat long after she is gone. Around her, the water is full of people doing the same thing. Hundreds of them. Some are screaming. Most are not, because at that temperature the body does not have the energy to scream for long. Behind her, the ship she came off of is going down by the bow, its lights still burning underwater, glowing green as it sinks. 9,000 people aboard, and almost none of them will live to see morning. You have never heard her name. You have almost certainly never heard the name of her ship. And here is the thing people get wrong about disaster at sea. When I say the words maritime tragedy, your mind goes to one place. It goes to a clear, cold night in April of 1912, to an iceberg and a band playing on a tilting deck and a great liner breaking in half under a sky full of stars. It goes to the Titanic. That ship has become the single most famous death toll in human history. Around 1,500 people died when it sank, and we have built films and museums and 100 years of mythology around those 1,500. We know the songs. We know the lifeboats. We know the violinist's name. But 1,500 is not a large number, not by the standards of the sea. The woman freezing in the Baltic was aboard a ship that killed roughly 6 times as many people in a single night, and you do not know it was ever there. The Titanic does not rank first among maritime disasters. It does not rank in the top 10. Depending on how you count, it may not crack the top 20. The most famous shipwreck in the world is, in the brutal arithmetic of drowning, a minor one. So that is the question I want to sit inside for the next while. If the Titanic was not the deadliest, then what was? And if ships went down carrying thousands more souls than that famous liner ever held, then why is it that we built a legend around the small one and let the enormous one sink twice? Once into the water, and once out of memory entirely. I spend my time reading passenger manifests and old maritime ledgers, the dry paperwork of who was aboard and who was not, and I will tell you up front that those documents do not just record the dead. They decide who gets remembered. That is what we are going to find out. Why the names you know are the wrong names, and what it costs the people whose names you don't. Let me take you through the ships that the Titanic stands in front of, blocking your view. Start with the woman in the Baltic, because her ship sits at the very top of the list. It was a liner that had once been a cruise ship for German workers, large and white and built for holidays. By the winter of 1945, it had been turned into a floating evacuation vessel, part of a desperate operation to carry German refugees and wounded soldiers west across the Baltic, away from the advancing Soviet army. It was built to hold something like 1,900 people in comfort. On its final voyage it carried, by the most careful modern estimates, more than 10,000. Refugees were packed into the drained swimming pool. They filled the corridors, the dining rooms, the decks. Mothers held children on stairwells for hours because there was nowhere to sit. And on the night of January 30th, a Soviet submarine put 3 torpedoes into its side. It went down in under an hour into water cold enough to kill in minutes. The number that died is not known precisely, and we will come back to why that is, but the best reconstructions put it above 9,000 and possibly closer to 10. 9,000. That is the Titanic 6 times over, in one ship, on one night, and the average person on the street has never heard the name Wilhelm Gustloff. Hold that number, 9,000. We are going to keep a count as we go, and the Titanic's 1,500 is already far behind us. Now come forward in time, to December of 1987, and move from the freezing Baltic to the warm, dark water of the Tablas Strait in the Philippines. A passenger ferry was making an overnight run between islands, the kind of routine voyage that happened 1,000 times a year, and that no one outside the region ever thought about. Its manifest listed around 1,500 passengers. The real figure, investigators later concluded, was more than 4,000 because the manifest was a work of fiction. Children traveled uncounted, tickets were sold past every limit, and nobody was keeping an honest list. In the middle of the night, it collided with an oil tanker carrying over 1 million liters of petroleum products. The sea itself caught fire. Passengers who jumped to escape the burning ferry surfaced into burning water. Of the more than 4,000 aboard, 26 survived. 26. It remains the deadliest peacetime shipwreck in human history, far deadlier than the Titanic, and it happened within the lifetime of most people watching this. You may never have heard its name either. The ferry was the Doña Paz. Keep counting. We have passed 13,000 dead across 2 ships, and we have not yet touched the Titanic's number a second time in the telling. There are more. In June of 1940, a British liner pressed into service to evacuate troops and civilians from France was bombed and sunk off the French coast. It was so overloaded that the true death toll has never been settled. Estimates run from 4,000 to as high as 7,000, any one of which dwarfs the Titanic. The British government suppressed the news at the time because the country could not afford the blow to morale, and the suppression worked so well that the Lancastria is barely remembered even now. In April of 1865, on the Mississippi River, a steamboat built for around 370 people was crammed with more than 2,000, most of them Union soldiers just released from Confederate prison camps, finally going home. 3 of its boilers exploded at once. Around 1,800 died, more than the Titanic, in American waters in an American disaster, and it vanished from the front pages within days because the country was reeling from the assassination of its president that same week. The dead of the Sultana were simply outshouted by other news. This is the pattern beginning to show itself, and I want you to notice the shape of it. The thing that killed these people was not, in the end, the iceberg or the torpedo or the boiler. Look at every ship I have named. The Gustloff, built for 2,000 carrying 10. The Doña Paz, rated for 1,500 carrying 4,000. The Lancastria, a death toll no one can even calculate because no one knew how many were aboard. The Sultana, a steamboat with 5 times its capacity of human beings standing on its decks. The real killer at sea, again and again, was not the water. It was the missing manifest. It was the simple fact that nobody had written down who was on the ship. And a person who was never counted on board is a person who is very easy not to count among the dead. So if these are the true monsters of maritime history, why does none of them live in your imagination, while a single April night in 1912 lives in all of it? To understand that, you first have to understand what we think the Titanic taught us, because we did learn a lesson from it. We just learned it so well that it crowded everything else out. Here is the story you already know, even if you have never studied it for a day in your life. A brand new ocean liner, the largest moving object ever built by human hands, sets out across the Atlantic on its maiden voyage. It is a floating palace, with a grand staircase and a swimming pool and first-class suites for the richest people alive. It has been called unsinkable, not officially, but in the press, in the public mind, in the confidence of the age. It is so confident that it carries lifeboats for only about half the people aboard, because lifeboats clutter the promenade and, after all, the ship is its own lifeboat. On the 4th night out, it strikes an iceberg in the dark, a glancing blow along the starboard side. There are not enough boats. The first ones go down half empty because no one truly believes the ship can sink. The band plays to keep people calm. The wireless operators tap out distress calls to ships too far away to come in time. And in a little under 3 hours, the unsinkable ship stands up on its end and breaks apart and goes down, taking around 1,500 people with it into water just above freezing. It is a perfect story. That is exactly the problem. It has everything a story is supposed to have. It has hubris, the unsinkable ship sunk on its first voyage, as though the sea itself wanted to punish human arrogance. It has a moral architecture you can hold in your hand, too few lifeboats, too much pride. It has the rich and the poor on the same doomed deck, the millionaires and the immigrants, the gates between the classes, every social tension of the age compressed into one tilting hull. It has heroes and cowards, the band that kept playing and the men who slipped into boats dressed as women. It has a clean, dramatic, watchable shape, with a beginning and a middle and an end. We took that shape and we decided it was the lesson of death at sea. The Titanic became shorthand for the whole subject. When we want to talk about catastrophe and pride and the limits of human engineering, we reach for it automatically, the way you reach for a light switch in your own house in the dark. And because it became the lesson, it became the measure. We started treating the Titanic as the worst thing that could happen on the ocean, the high-water mark of maritime horror, the disaster all other disasters are smaller than, which is precisely backwards. And if you are finding this as fascinating as I am, take a second to subscribe, because I dig into exactly this kind of thing every week. The history that everyone thinks they know, and the parts of it that turn out to be the opposite of true. Now let me show you why the most famous shipwreck in the world is famous for everything, except the number of people it killed. Here is the surprising part. The Titanic is not remembered because of how many died. It is remembered because of who died and when, and most of all, because of who was watching. Think about who was aboard that ship. The Titanic carried some of the wealthiest and most prominent people in the Western world, industrialists, aristocrats, names that filled the society pages on 2 continents. When they drowned, the newspapers did not have to invent a reason to care. The dead were already famous. Their deaths were front-page news in New York and London before the survivors had even been brought ashore, because the readers of those papers knew those names, had read about those people, had perhaps envied them. A disaster that kills the celebrated is a disaster the press covers as though the world has ended. A disaster that kills the poor, the foreign, the uncounted, is a paragraph, if that. Now think about when it happened. April of 1912 was a moment of deep peace and deep confidence in the industrial West, an age that believed in progress as a kind of religion. The Titanic was supposed to be the proof of that progress, the biggest, the safest, the most advanced. When it sank, it did not just kill 1,500 people. It punctured the self-image of an entire civilization. The story mattered out of all proportion to its body count, because it arrived at exactly the moment that could least absorb it, and it said something the age did not want to hear about the limits of its own machines. And then think about who was watching, because this is the part that decides everything. The Titanic sank in peacetime, in heavily traveled North Atlantic waters, carrying English-speaking passengers, bound for the media capital of the world. There were survivors, and the survivors gave interviews. There were inquiries on both sides of the Atlantic, with sworn testimony transcribed and published. There were photographs, and within a year there were films. The disaster fell directly into the lap of a hungry, literate, English-language press at the height of its power, and that press never let go. Now hold every one of those ships against that standard. The Wilhelm Gustloff went down in the last desperate months of a world war, carrying German refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, civilians of a nation that was about to lose and be condemned by history, with no surviving press corps, no public inquiry, no sympathetic newspapers waiting to mourn them. The Doña Paz sank in the dark off a developing nation, carrying poor families on a routine ferry that the international media had no reason to know existed, and with only 26 survivors, there was barely anyone left to tell it. The Lancastria's dead were deliberately hidden by a government that needed the country not to know. The Sultana's dead were drowned out by an assassination. None of these disasters had what the Titanic had. None of them had the right victims, at the right moment, in front of the right cameras. Fame and fatality were never the same axis. They were never even close. A ship's place in memory has almost nothing to do with how many people it killed. and almost everything to do with whether the world was set up to grieve them. Which brings us to the cruelest pattern of all, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. The more people a disaster killed, the less likely we are to remember it. It sounds impossible. It sounds like it should run the other way. Surely the worst horrors should leave the deepest marks, but run back through the count. The Titanic, the one we will never forget, killed around 1500. The Sultana, which most people have never heard of, killed close to 1800. The Doña Paz, which barely registered outside its region, killed more than 4,000. The Gustloff, effectively erased from popular memory, killed 9,000 or more. The line on the graph between fame and death does not just fail to rise. It falls. The deadlier the ship, the dimmer its place in our memory, almost as a rule. And it gets worse, because at the top of that list we lose even the ability to count. We know that around 1,500 died on the Titanic with real precision. We have the manifests, the survivor lists, the inquiries, names attached to nearly every body and every absence. But the Gustloff, the honest answer is that we do not know how many died, and we never will. So many of the refugees crowded aboard in those final chaotic days were never written down at all. Nobody had time to keep a list while a city was falling behind them. The best historians can do is reconstruct a range 9,000, perhaps more, and admit that the true number went into the Baltic uncounted and stayed there. The Lancastria is the same, a death toll given as a span of thousands because the ship was so overloaded that no record of its passengers survives. These are the largest losses of human life in the history of going to sea, and we cannot tell you how large. The scale of the horror is the very thing that destroyed the paperwork that would have let us measure it. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the dark heart of this whole subject. A person who is never counted on board is a person who can never be counted as lost. The same overcrowding that killed these thousands, the packed decks, the sold past capacity tickets, the manifests that were fiction, is the exact thing that then erased them from history. They died because no one was keeping track, and then, because no one was keeping track, they were forgotten. The 1,500 of the Titanic each have a name and a story and a place in a book. The 10,000 of the Gustloff are a shrug and an estimate. We remember the small, well-documented tragedy in extraordinary detail, and we let the enormous, undocumented ones dissolve, not in spite of their size, but because of it. So where does all of this leave us? Because I do not want to end on the idea that memory is simply unfair, even though it is. There is something the Titanic did that none of the deadlier ships managed to do, and it is the one genuine reason its fame is worth something. The Titanic was seen. That is the whole difference, and it turned out to matter enormously. Because it sank in front of the entire literate world in peacetime with inquiries and testimony and outrage. It could not be ignored or buried or outshouted. And that visibility was converted almost immediately into change. Within 2 years of the sinking, the first International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea was signed. The body of rules we still sail under today, in updated form, more than a century later. It is the reason every passenger ship is now required to carry enough lifeboats for every single soul aboard, the exact failure that doomed so many on the Titanic. It is the reason ships must keep a continuous radio watch around the clock, so that a distress call in the night is always heard by someone close enough to come. It established the patrols that to this day track the icebergs drifting down through the North Atlantic shipping lanes, so that no ship need ever again steam blind into the dark at full speed. And it began, slowly, the long fight toward honest passenger manifests, toward the simple, radical idea that a ship should know who is aboard it, so that the sea can never again quietly swallow thousands of people it was never told were there. That is the thing worth holding onto. The fame of the Titanic was not earned by its dead being more important than the dead of the Gustloff or the Doña Paz. They were not. A child who froze in the Baltic was worth exactly as much as a millionaire who went down off Newfoundland. But because the world happened to be watching that one April night, The 1,500 of the Titanic were able to do something the uncounted thousands never got the chance to do. They were able to change the rules. Their deaths bought the lifeboats and the radio watch and the ice patrols that have saved an unknowable number of lives in the century since, lives that were never lost, on voyages that ended safely, by people who will never know they were protected by the dead of 1912. And maybe that is the closest thing to justice the sea allows, because here is what I have come to believe, after enough time spent reading the manifests of the drowned. Fame is a terrible ruler for grief. The ships we remember are not the ones that took the most from us. They are the ones the world was set up to mourn. But memory is not only a matter of luck, it is also a choice. We can choose to learn the name of the ship in the Baltic. We can choose to count the 4,000 off the coast of the Philippines. We can choose to say the number out loud even when the manifest is missing, and the number is only an estimate, because an honest estimate of a forgotten loss is worth more than a perfect record of a famous one. What a society remembers decides who it bothers to protect. The Titanic mattered because we looked. The least we owe the others is to look at them too. The line between a death that changed the world and a death that vanished from it was almost never the size of the loss. It was only ever whether anyone was watching, and whether the rest of us afterward chose to remember. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is built for, the kind who wants the real shape of history, and not just the famous outline of it. Subscribe, and I will keep pulling the forgotten ships back up out of the dark, one name at a time. I'll see you in the next one.